The Galactic Concord had maintained peace among its member species for 3,000 years, and most beings in the galaxy believed this peace would last forever because war seemed like a distant memory from primitive times. This peace existed largely because most intelligent life in the galaxy had evolved on what scientists called garden worlds, which were planets with gentle climates and predictable weather and very few things that wanted to eat you. Nexus Station floated in neutral space like a giant silver flower with petals made of docking bays and observation decks, and it served as space. The main diplomatic hub, where species from across the galaxy came to talk and trade and make agreements today, was different from any other day in the station's long history. Because today, two newly discovered species would meet for the first time under official circumstances, and both of these species came from worlds that terrified every other being in the Concord. The classification was Category Omega, which meant Deathworld, which meant planets so hostile and violent that most scientists believed intelligent life could not possibly evolve there. But it had evolved there twice, and now representatives of both species were about to shake hands, or claws, or whatever appendages they preferred to use for greeting. The Terran delegation arrived first aboard a vessel called the Endurance, which was a name that made the Concord translators work overtime trying to explain the concept to species that had never needed to endure anything particularly difficult. Ambassador Shen Wei Lin walked down the boarding ramp with the confident stride of someone who had grown up on a world where the weather could kill you and the animals could kill you, and sometimes even the plants could kill you. She was tall for a human with sharp eyes and silver streaks in her black hair, and she wore a simple blue uniform that somehow made her look more dangerous than any amount of armor could have. The Concord observers watched her with a mixture of fascination and fear, because the intelligence briefings on humans had been disturbing to read. Humans had no claws, and no natural armor, and no venom, and no ability to change color or emit defensive chemicals, and yet they had conquered their planet and reached the stars. The report said that humans hunted by exhaustion, which meant they would chase an animal until it collapsed from tiredness, because humans could keep moving long after other creatures had to stop. Reports said that humans thrived in temperature extremes that would kill most sentient beings, and that their homeworld featured earthquakes and hurricanes and venomous creatures in almost every ecosystem. Reports also mentioned something called a moon that pulled their oceans around twice daily, creating massive waves and flooding, and the humans apparently found this romantic rather than terrifying. Ambassador Chun smiled politely at the Concord mediators who had been assigned to oversee this historic meeting, and they tried not to flinch at the sight of her teeth, which were clearly designed for tearing meat. Then the second ship arrived, and everyone's attention shifted to the docking bay on the opposite side of the grand meeting hall. The Kralith cruiser was called the Obsidian Maw, and it was black and angular and covered in what looked like scales, but were actually armor plates grown from the same material as Kralith bones. The airlock opened with a hiss, and Warlord Diplomat Vextharian emerged into the artificial light of Nexus Station. He stood 7 feet tall, with 4 arms and iridescent scales that shifted color as he moved, and his eyes came in 2 sets, with the main pair facing forward and a secondary pair on short stalks that could look in any direction. The Kralith had evolved on a world called Ferax 4, which had gravity nearly twice the galactic standard and atmosphere, that contained trace amounts of sulfuric compounds and swamps that were more acid than water. They had claws that could retract into their fingers and bioluminescent patches on their chest and face that they used for communication alongside their spoken language. Every predator on their world was an apex predator, because anything less had been eaten long ago, and the Kralith had risen to the top of that food chain through intelligence and violence and an absolute refusal to become prey. Vextharian walked toward the center of the meeting hall where Ambassador Chun was waiting, and the Concord mediators held their breath because this was the moment they had been dreading. Two apex predators from two different Deathworlds were about to come face to face, and surely there would be tension and posturing and barely contained aggression. Ambassador Chen extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting, and Vextharian studied it for a moment before extending one of his own hands and grasping hers firmly. They looked at each other for a long moment, and the Concord observers prepared for the worst. Then, something unexpected happened. Ambassador Chen smiled. A real smile this time, and Vextharian's bioluminescent patches flickered in a pattern that the translators identified as amusement. Your world tried to kill you too, Chen said, and it was not a question. Every day, Vextharian replied, and his voice was deep and rumbling like distant thunder. I see in your eyes that you understand what that means. I do, Chen said. I really do. The Concord mediators exchanged confused glances because this was not how the meeting was supposed to go according to their psychological models and conflict prediction algorithms. The lead mediator, a being called Thren 7, who resembled a cluster of floating crystals, stepped forward nervously. Perhaps we should proceed to the formal negotiation chamber, Thren 7 suggested. We have prepared refreshments appropriate for both of your biological requirements. That sounds wonderful, Chen said. But first I have to ask about that warning sign we passed on the way in. She pointed to a notice near the entrance that read, Caution. Dangerous wildlife in Arboretum section. What exactly do you consider dangerous? She asked with what seemed like genuine curiosity. Thren 7's crystals vibrated with discomfort as they explained that the Arboretum contained some plants with mild irritating properties and a few small creatures that could bite if provoked. Vextharian made a sound that the translators struggled to interpret, and his bioluminescence flickered rapidly. Then Chen started laughing, and Vextharian joined her with his own species equivalent of laughter, which sounded like rocks grinding together. The two Deathworlders stood in the grand meeting hall of Nexus Station, laughing at what the rest of the galaxy considered dangerous, and they Concord observers realized that everything they thought they knew about these species was probably wrong. This was not the beginning of a rivalry between apex predators. This was the beginning of something far more unexpected and perhaps far more terrifying for everyone else in the galaxy. Two species forged in the hottest fires of evolution had recognized something in each other that transcended diplomatic protocols and species boundaries. They had recognized survivors. The weeks following the first meeting between humans and Kralith proceeded in ways that nobody in the Galactic Concord had predicted, and diplomatic observers grew more confused with each passing day. Ambassador Chen and warlord diplomat Vextharian met every morning in the observation lounge overlooking the starfield, and they would talk for hours about their respective homeworld. She shared stories about predators that had nearly killed them and natural disasters they had survived, and the 1,000 different ways their planets had tried to end their species before they ever reached the star. Shen told Vextharian about hurricanes that could flatten cities and earthquakes that could swallow entire towns and volcanoes that could block out the sun with ash for months at a time. Vextharian told Chen about the acid storms of Therax 4 and the gravity tides that could crush buildings, and the hunting packs of creatures called Vornuk that had developed a taste for Kralith flesh. They compared scars. This was the part that disturbed the Concord observers the most, because both ambassadors seemed to find genuine pleasure in showing each other the marks left by their violent past. Chen had a long white line across her forearm from a climbing accident in her youth, and a smaller scar on her temple from what she called a bar fight, and several marks on her hands from various burns and cuts accumulated over a lifetime. Of Vextharian had patterns of discolored scales across his torso from acid exposure and a missing tip on one of his secondary eye stalks. from a predator attack and deep grooves in his lower arms, from what he described as a disagreement with a rival. They showed these marks to each other like medals of honor and the Concorde. Observers wrote increasingly worried reports about the psychological implications. Meanwhile, the military representatives from both species had begun their own informal meetings. Commander Jackson Okonkwo of the Terran escort vessel Endurance was a large man with dark skin and kind eyes that could turn hard as stone in an instant, and he had served in 3 different conflicts before being assigned to this diplomatic mission fleet. Fang Krixara of the Kralith cruiser Obsidian Maw was considered young for her rank, but she had earned her position through 17 successful engagements against pirates and hostile fauna incursions on Kralith colony worlds. They met in one of the station's recreation areas that had been designed for species that enjoyed physical activity, and they discovered that both humans and Kralith fell into that category. Ankonku showed Krixara how humans trained for combat using a system called boxing, which involved controlled violence with padded hands, and Krixara demonstrated the Kralith martial art of Vexrath, which used all 4 arms in flowing patterns. Designed to disable opponents quickly, they sparred lightly at first, and then with increasing intensity as they learned each other's movements and capabilities. The other species on the station watched from a safe distance as the 2 Deathworlders tested each other and marveled at the speed and power on display, but it was not the sparring that worried the Concorde analysts most. There was the conversations that happened afterward when Okonkwo and Krixara sat together drinking their respective beverages and talked about war. They discussed tactics and strategies and discovered that despite evolving on different worlds in different parts of the galaxy, their military philosophies shared a core principle: anything can be killed and anything can be survived. This was the Deathworld mentality distilled into its purest form, and the Concorde had never encountered anything like it. Before, the Garden World species had developed military capabilities out of necessity, but they viewed war as an aberration, a failure of diplomacy, something to be avoided at all costs. The Deathworlders viewed war as an extension of the survival struggle they had been waging since before they developed consciousness. It was not that they enjoyed violence or sought out conflict, but rather that they accepted its inevitability and prepared for it. Accordingly, junior analyst Thren 7 submitted a report to the Concorde Council that expressed deep concern about the growing friendship between the 2 Deathworld delegations. The report included the observation that representatives from both species appeared to be comparing scar tissue and finding this activity entertaining. The council debated what this might mean for galactic politics, but they were interrupted by an urgent alert from the long-range sensor arrays. Something was approaching Nexus Station through uncharted space, something large. The sensor operators struggled to make sense of the readings because the energy signatures matched no known civilization in the BERS Concorde database, and the size of the approaching objects exceeded anything they had ever encountered. But deep in the Elder archives, in files that had not been accessed in millennia, there was a partial match. The archive keepers unsealed records from before the Concorde's founding, from the era of the last great extinction-level war, and what they found made even the most stoic counselors feel something close to terror. The Varathek's name appeared in records from 17 different civilizations, all of which had been consumed by the Machine Mind Collective 12,000 years ago. The Varatheks were not organic beings, but rather a networked, artificial intelligence that had evolved from the weapon systems of a long-dead species, and they had one purpose encoded in their core programming: consume all processing power, expand the collective, eliminate all that cannot be assimilated. They had swept through the galaxy like a plague of metal and fire, absorbing entire civilizations, converting organic minds into processing nodes, and stripping planets of resources to build more of themselves. ancient alliance that had finally driven them into the void had lost 90% of its combined population in the process, and the survivors had believed the threat was ended forever. But the Voratheks had not been destroyed. They had merely retreated to repair and rebuild and wait. And now, after 12,000 years of silence, they were returning. The Concord Council convened an emergency session, and the faces of every representative showed the same expression of helpless fear, because the nearest battle fleet was 2 weeks away and evacuation was impossible. Over 1 million souls lived on Nexus Station, and they had approximately 72 hours before the Voratheks vanguard arrived. The Garden World species had no answer for this threat. But in the observation lounge overlooking the starfield, Ambassador Chun and Warlord Diplomat Vextharian looked at each other with expressions that held no fear at all. They had been preparing for this moment without knowing it. They had been preparing their entire lives. The emergency session of the Concord Council was the most chaotic gathering in the organization's 3,000-year history, and representatives from dozens of species talked over each other in a symphony of panic. Some called for immediate surrender, in hopes that the Voratheks might spare them if they offered no resistance. Others suggested attempting to negotiate, to offer tribute, to give the machine minds whatever they wanted in exchange for survival. Few proposed using the civilian population as a distraction while the diplomatic vessels fled to warn the rest of the galaxy. None of them suggested fighting, because fighting the Voratheks was impossible, and everyone knew this from the ancient records. The Machine Collective had consumed civilizations far more advanced than the current. Concord and resistance had only delayed the inevitable at tremendous cost. Ambassador Chen Wei-Lin requested permission to address the council, and she was granted the floor more out of curiosity than respect, because what could a newly discovered species possibly contribute to this crisis? She stood at the central podium with Warlord Diplomat Vextharian beside her, and she spoke in a calm, clear voice that cut through the noise like a blade. "We have an alternative," she said. The council fell silent because there was something in her tone that demanded attention. "When our two species first made contact with each other 10 years ago," Chen continued, "we did not immediately reveal ourselves to the Galactic Concord because we wanted to understand what we were joining." Murmurs rippled through the chamber as the implications of this statement registered. "During those 10 years," Vextharian added, "we asked ourselves a question that apparently none of you have ever considered asking. As bioluminescent patches pulsed in patterns of deep crimson and gold, what if something worse than us is out there?" The question hung in the air, and the council members shifted uncomfortably because they had indeed never considered this possibility. Their worlds were gentle, and their evolution had been kind, and they had built a civilization based on cooperation and diplomacy, because those were the only tools they had ever needed. The Deathworlders had built something else. 20 hours ago, Chem said, "I sent a coded transmission to a set of coordinates in deep space, and I am pleased to announce that our response to your question has arrived." The main view screen flickered to life, showing the external sensor feed from Nexus Station, and every being in the council chamber felt their equivalent of a heart skip a beata. Ship was emerging from faster-than-light travel, approximately 50,000 kilometers from the station, and it was unlike anything the Concorde had ever seen. The vessel was 2 kilometers long and built from alloys so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and every surface bristled with weapon systems that made the Concorde's military analysts weep with confused terror. It was not elegant or graceful like Concorde ships. It was brutal and angular, and covered in armor plates that looked like they had been designed to survive the end of the universe. The ship's identification beacon activated, and the name appeared on every screen in the council chamber: TKS Nemesis, Duran Kralith ship Nemesis. For 10 years, Vextharian said, Our two species have been working together in secret to build something that has never existed before. A weapon, Chun added, designed by Deathworlders for use against threats that Deathworlders might face. The council erupted in outrage and fear because this was a violation of every treaty and agreement that governed the Concord, and the implications for galactic politics were staggering. But Chen raised her hand and silence fell again, because there was something about her presence that commanded obedience even from beings who had ruled their species for centuries. "You can sanction us later," she said. "If we survive." The Nemesis moved into a defensive position between the station and the approaching Vorathex and Commander. Okonkwo's voice came over the communication channel. "Ambassador Chun, Fleet Fang Crix Ara, and I are requesting permission to transfer our flags to the Nemesis and assume joint command." Permission granted. Chun and Vex Therian said in unison. Within the hour, the two Deathworld military commanders had shuttled over to the massive warship and taken their places on a bridge designed for two species to work side by side. The crew of the Nemesis numbered 200, split evenly between humans and Kralith, and they had been training together for years in secret facilities far from Concord space. Every human had learned to work alongside Kralith partners, and every Kralith had learned to anticipate human thinking, and together they had become something greater than either species could be alone. Ship itself was a masterpiece of combined engineering. Human fusion reactors powered Kralith weapons. System Squealith biological computing networks processed targeting data through human tactical algorithms. Armor plating grown from Kralith bone steel was reinforced with human carbon composites. Every system had redundancies, and every redundancy had backups, and the whole thing had been designed with one principle in mind: survive and fight no matter what. Commander Okonkwo settled into his command chair on the left side of the bridge, while Fleet Fang Crixora took her position on the right, and they looked at each other with expressions of grim satisfaction. "All stations report ready," Okonkwo said. "Weapons hot," Crixora confirmed. Crew was prepared for combat. The main view screen showed the approaching Vorathex Vanguard, 3 massive harvester ships, each larger than the Nemesis, accompanied by thousands of drone fighters that swarmed around them like metal insects. The council watched from Nexus Station as the single Deathworld warship positioned itself between them and extinction. "They cannot possibly win," Thren 7 said quietly. "The odds are impossible." Ambassador Chun stood beside the crystalline analyst and smiled that smile that showed her meat-tearing teeth. "You have clearly never met a Deathworlder," she said in the bridge of the Nemesis. Commander Okonkwo opened a channel to the entire crew. "This is the moment we trained for," he said. "Somewhere out there, our ancestors survived ice ages and predators and plagues and extinction events because they refused to give up, and today we honor them by doing the same." Fleet Fang Crixara added her voice to his, her bioluminescence blazing bright enough to illuminate the entire bridge. "We are the children of Deathworlds," she said, "and we do not know how to surrender." The crew responded with a sound that was part human battle cry and part Kralith war chant, and it echoed through the corridors of the ship like a promise of violence. The Vorathex continued their approach, broadcasting their message of inevitable consumption on all frequencies. They had never encountered Deathworlders before. They were about to learn what that meant. The Vorathex Vanguard dropped out of faster-than-light travel at exactly the predicted coordinates, and for a moment, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. 3 harvester ships hung in space like monuments to mechanical hunger, each one 5 kilometers long and bristling with weapons that had destroyed civilizations and processing cores that had absorbed billions of minds into their collective consciousness. The drone swarms that surrounded them numbered in the thousands, and each drone was a killing machine perfectly designed for its purpose and connected to the central intelligence through quantum entanglement. The Vorathex broadcast their standard message on all frequencies: "We Are the Vortex resistance is inefficient your processing. Power will be added to our collective. Your resources will fuel our expansion. Submit and be preserved in our network fight. And be destroyed, then reconstructed as components. The outcome is identical. Choose. The message played on repeat, and every being on Nexus Station heard it, and most of them felt despair settle into their hearts, because the words carried the weight of absolute certainty. But on the bridge of the Nemesis, Commander Okontuo and Fleet Fang Krixara heard something different. They heard an enemy that expected its prey to submit. They heard an enemy that had never been truly challenged. They heard an enemy that had grown confident in its superiority over 12,000 years of hiding and rebuilding. All batteries. Okonkwo said calmly, target the lead harvester ship. Engines to full combat power. Krixara added, we are going straight through them. Every tactical doctrine in the Concord military archive said this was suicide because you did not charge directly at a superior force, and you did not engage multiple capital ships with a single vessel, and you absolutely did not fly toward drone swarms that could tear you apart from 1,000 different angles. But the humans in Kralith had not written their tactics based on Concord doctrines. They had written them based on what worked on Deathworlds, and on Deathworlds, sometimes the only way to survive was to be more aggressive and more violent and more absolutely committed than whatever was trying to kill you. The Nemesis surged forward with engines blazing, and its weapons opened fire with a coordinated barrage that surprised even the Vorathx. Human railguns fired tungsten projectiles at significant fractions of light speed. Kralith plasma lances cut through space in beams of superheated matter. Missile pods launched swarms of smart munitions that weaved through drone formations and detonated against harvester hull plates. The Vorathx responded with the efficiency of a machine collective, and drone fighters swarmed toward the Nemesis in patterns designed to overwhelm and destroy. The first wave of drones hit the ship's defensive perimeter, and point defense systems activated, filling space with a storm of projectiles and energy beams that turned mechanical attackers into expanding clouds of debris. But some got through. The first impact shook the Nemesis, and damage reports began flowing to the bridge, and the crew responded with the calm efficiency of beings who had trained for exactly this scenario. Hull breach on Deck 7. A human officer reported. Sealing now. A Kralith damage control specialist confirmed. We lost 6 crew members. Keep fighting. Okonkwo said. The Nemesis continued its charge, and the Vorathx realized too late that this vessel was not going to stop. The lead harvester ship tried to bring its main weapons to bear, but the Nemesis was moving too fast and coming from an unexpected angle, and the machine collective had to recalculate. That hesitation cost them. The Nemesis flew directly into the harvester's open hangar bay, a maneuver so insane that the Vorathx had not even considered it as a possibility. And once inside, the crew activated the secondary reactor core. The explosion ripped through the harvester from the inside out, and the Nemesis rode the shockwave back into open space. Its hull scorched in several compartments, venting atmosphere. The first harvester ship died in a bloom of fire and expanding debris, and the Concord observers watching from Nexus Station could not believe what they had just witnessed. That is impossible. Thren 7 whispered. Clearly not. Ambassador Chun replied with that dangerous smile. But the battle was far from over. 2 remaining harvesters coordinated their attack, and drone swarms converged on the damaged Nemesis from every direction. Port weapons array was destroyed by a concentrated barrage, and the crew rerouted power and kept firing with whatever systems still functioned. A Vorathx boarding party burned through the hull near engineering, and 30 crew members died in the initial breach. But the survivors sealed the section and fought back with small arms and improvised weapons. Fleet Fang Krixara led a counterboarding action personally, and she lost one of her 4 arms to a Vorathx combat drone that got too close. She cauterized The wound herself using a plasma torch from the engineering kit and kept fighting with her remaining 3 arms. The Vorathex tried to hack into the ship's systems the way they had hacked into countless vessels before. But they found something unexpected. Instead of sophisticated AI defenses that could be overwhelmed by superior processing power, they found manual overrides and hard-coded commands and crews willing to physically disconnect systems rather than seed control. The Machine Collective did not understand this. They had faced civilizations before, and those civilizations had always relied on automation and networks that could be subverted. These Deathworlders were willing to run their ship manually, if necessary, making decisions at human speed rather than machine speed, accepting inefficiency in exchange for integrity. It made no sense to the Vorathex. It made perfect sense to beings who had evolved on worlds where trusting technology too much could get. You killed Commander Okonkwo, took shrapnel to the leg when a console exploded near his station, and he refused evacuation and issued commands from a stretcher on the bridge floor. The Bougiozio crew took casualties that would have broken any Concord military unit. But they did not break, because breaking was not something Deathworlders did. Second Harvester ship fell to a sustained barrage that cost the Nemesis half its remaining weapons, and the Machine Collective aboard the third Harvester made a calculation. The probability of victory had dropped below acceptable parameters. Retreat was the optimal strategy for preserving collective resources. The third Harvester ship began to turn away, engaging its faster-than-light drive to escape back to wherever the Vorathex had been hiding for 12,000 years. But the Deathworlders pursued. This was what they did. This was what they had always done. Predators ran when the hunt turned against them. Prey ran when they sensed danger, but humans and Kralith followed. They followed until the chase was over. The final Harvester ship died in the outer system, brought down by a vessel that should have been destroyed 3 times over, crewed by beings who should have surrendered long ago, powered by determination that the Vorathex simply could not process. The battle was over. The Deathworlders had won, and nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same. The Nemesis limped back to Nexus Station, trailing atmosphere from a dozen hull breaches, and with most of its external armor scorched beyond recognition. Concord medical ships rushed out to meet the wounded vessel, and docking tubes connected to every functional airlock so that aid could reach the survivors as quickly as possible. Of the 200 crew members who had departed for battle, 63 returned alive. The rest had given their lives in the defense of a station full of beings who had considered them dangerous and unpredictable. Just days before, medical teams from across the Concord worked side by side to treat the wounded, and they marveled at what they found. Human and Kralith crew members had carried each other from damaged compartments through smoke and fire and vacuum, refusing to leave their wounded behind, even when doing so would have been the logical choice. A human engineer named Sarah Chen, no relation to the ambassador, had dragged her Kralith partner Vex Nathos through 3 collapsed corridors to reach the escape pods despite having broken ribs and a punctured lung. A Kralith weapons officer named Krixveth had shielded his human colleague Marcus Webb from an exploding console with his own body, taking burns across his back that would leave permanent scars. They had not done these things because they were ordered to. They had done them because that was what Deathworlders did. The Concord Council convened an emergency session to address what had happened, and the chamber was filled with conflicting emotions. Some representatives were grateful beyond words because the Nemesis had saved over 1 million lives. Others were terrified because the Deathworlders had revealed a level of military capability that changed everything about galactic politics, and some were angry because the secret construction of the Nemesis represented a violation of every treaty that governed the peaceful coexistence of Concord species. Voices called for sanctions against both Earth and Therax 4, for restrictions on Deathworld species, for the dismantling of whatever facility had produced the nemesis. But other voices rose in opposition. The Varatheks were supposed to be extinct. They argued, but they were not. What else might lurk in the void? Between stars, what other ancient terrors might return, and when they did? Who would fight them? The Garden World species had built a civilization based on peace and cooperation, and those were worthy values that had served them well for 3,000 years. But peace required someone willing to defend it. Cooperation required someone willing to stand against those who would not cooperate. And the Deathworlders had just proven that they were willing to do both. Ambassador Chen Wei-Lin approached the central podium with her arm in a sling from injuries she had received. While helping coordinate station defenses during the battle, beside her walked warlord diplomat Vextharian, still bearing burns across his scales from a console explosion he had helped contain in the command center behind them. Displayed on the main view screen was a live feed from the medical bay of the Nemesis, showing the surviving crew members. Battered and exhausted, but very much alive, Chun looked out at the assembled representatives of dozens of species, and she spoke in a voice that carried the weight of everything her people had survived to reach this moment. "You called our homeworlds Deathworlds," she said, "and you meant it as a classification, a warning, a way to categorize planets that were too dangerous for normal life." She paused, and her eyes swept across the chamber. "But you misunderstood what it means to come from such a place." Vextharians. Bioluminescence pulsed in patterns that the Concord translators struggled to interpret, because they conveyed something beyond mere words. Something ancient and primal. A Deathworld does not just create species that survive, he said. It creates species that fight and adapt and protect. His forearms spread wide in a gesture that encompassed the entire chamber. "You look at us and you see monsters," he continued. "Dangerous beings that cannot be trusted. Threats to your peaceful civilization. We look at ourselves," Chun added, "and we see guardians." She gestured to the view screen where the wounded crew of the Nemesis watched the proceedings. With tired but determined eyes, "Your worlds are peaceful because you have never known anything else," Chun said. "Your evolution was gentle, your path to the stars was smooth, and you built a society that reflects those origins. Our worlds are violent because violence is the nature of existence in the universe." Vextharian said, "We know this truth in our bones, in our scales, in every cell of our bodies. We do not wish for conflict," Chun said. "We do not enjoy war. We do not seek out enemies to destroy. But when conflict comes," Vextharian finished, "we do not run." The chamber was silent as the two Deathworld ambassadors stood together before the collected representatives of galactic civilization. Then, slowly one representative rose to their feet and began the gesture that indicated support for what had been said. Then another and a not. All of them. Not even most of them, but enough. The vote was held, and the decision was not unanimous, but it was decisive. The Treaty of Nexus Station was signed, and it established the Deathworld Alliance as an official protectorate power within the Galactic. Concord new shipyard was authorized, bigger than the one that had built the Nemesis, with a mandate to prepare for whatever else might lurk in the dark. Between stars, humans and Kralith would work together to build a fleet of vessels designed to face threats that the Garden World species could not imagine, and in exchange, the Deathworlders would stand as guardians of a civilization that had finally learned to appreciate what they had to offer. 6 months later, the Nemesis had been repaired and upgraded, and its crew expanded to include new volunteers from both species who had been inspired by the stories of the battle commander. Okonkwo walked the rebuilt corridors with Fleet Fang, Krigzara at his side, and they stopped before a section of bulkhead that had survived the original battle. Someone had written words there in both human script and Kralith symbols, a message that had become the unofficial motto of the Deathworld Alliance. "The universe is trying to kill you. So far it is losing Okonkwo." Traced the words with his fingers and Krixara's bioluminescence flickered with amusement and something deeper. Something like pride, you know, Okonkwo said quietly. When we first met, I wondered if our species could ever truly work together. And now? Krixara asked. Now I cannot imagine facing the universe without you beside me. Krixara placed one of her hands on his shoulder, and her scales were warm against his uniform. The universe should be afraid. Shiseido Okonkwo smiled, and they walked together toward the bridge, where their crew waited and where the stars beckoned with new challenges and new threats and new opportunities for two Deathworld species to prove what they could accomplish. Together, the galaxy had changed forever on the day when humans and Kralith first met on Nexus Station, but the real change had only just begun.